Hello everyone, today we're going to discuss network detection response technologies. What are the capabilities of these tools, how easy or difficult they are to maintain, and the integration with a next-gen SOC, and of course some of the detections we have seen in recent times. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dan Crossley from Vectra. Dan, you're very welcome. There's a little bit of background on Dan. So he's with Vectra for almost 3 years now, and he's a security engineering director for the UK and Ireland. So he's looking after all the tech guys. In Dan's previous roles, he was a specialist around the field of SIEM technology, and he worked for 10 years for various SIEM vendors, if I'm right, Dan, including Logarithm and McAfee. And you were regional SIEM product specialist, I believe, for McAfee. And prior to that, you worked for an Australian-based vendor called Huntsman. So welcome to Threatcast, Dan. Good to have you on board.
Thank you for having me, Colin. Good to be here.
No worries. You've watched a few of them, and our listeners have too. That some of our close partners we bring on board for these chats just to learn a little bit more about various technologies and how they are deployed, the benefits of them, and so on. One of the things, Dan, is network traffic analysis, I suppose, is where that was the home of NDR. I think it was in 2020 thereabouts that Gartner renamed as NDR and more shiny blue lights and all of that good stuff. But tell me, what are kind of the key components of network detection response system?
Okay, I'd probably say that NDR first started becoming a thing around about 2016, 2017, when the vendors started cropping up at InfoSec London. And to me, I think the demarcation is really where you're using artificial intelligence analytic techniques on network traffic, which are signature-less. The goal of an NDR tool is to detect threats as they traverse a modern network. And the way that you did that from effectively probably going back to the 1950s all the way up to about 2010, 2015-ish, I think what you largely had was your IPS. And if anyone's managed an IPS, you'll know that the IPS is largely signature-based. So what the IPS is doing, it's looking for signatures and sequences, byte strings within packet payloads that would indicate that there is some kind of threat. Now, NDR, to answer your question, NDR is like the evolution of that, where it's signature-less. So we're trying to apply threat detection to network traffic, but in a manner which is signature-less. And the way that is implemented is using artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to do that network traffic analysis.
So it's only taken us about 60 seconds to get AI and ML brought into the conversation. I love it. You can't avoid it these days, no matter what. You just cannot avoid it.
No.
Thanks for that, Dan. So what are the kind of benefits of implementing NDR for an organization? I mean, they've got a plethora of vendors out there offering lots of different security tools and great advantages. So why should they go for an IPS? I guess, I'm thinking it's kind of really old school stuff. Yet you still see with some of, say, the firewall vendors that IPS is still part of that technology stack. So if we got to push that aside and go, well, what are the key benefits around the NDR versus other tech? Let me put it to you another way. Why am I going to spend my budget on NDR and not another security tool?
Okay, it's a good question. And I think it comes down to some kind of gap, right? And this is usually what our customers identify. They identify that there is some kind of gap in their detection approach or their overall security architecture, which means that there is an opportunity for detections which they're not currently leveraging, i.e. on the network. Okay, so let's kind of break it down. I think that you're right. IPS, back when I was at McAfee back in 2015, standalone IPS was still very much a thing. Like, it was a really big market share, and it has been, like way back when even the internet first started. IPS was kind of around. Like, there was a very old paper, I think it was from the 1980s actually, is talking about proposing an IPS kind of system, which is effectively applying signatures to network traffic. You fast forward in I'd say between, up to about 2015-ish, standalone IPS was still very much a thing. McAfee was certainly selling it, and we did have some big customers. But between 2015 and now, what's happened is IPS has rolled into the next-gen firewall. It's still very much a key component of the next-gen firewall. You've often got like an IPS blade or some kind of threat detection blade for which IPS signatures would be ingested and applied to the network traffic. Now, the problem with that is that the firewall can only apply this. First of all, the firewall can only apply this to the traffic that it sees. Not all traffic passes through the firewall, right? First of all. And then second of all, Probably one of the biggest issues with IPS is the signature management. So if you've ever managed an IPS, you kind of know what I mean. And back to when I was with McAfee, I think that the most successful customers that had implemented IPS, they almost had a team, at least one individual, one key individual that was an IPS expert, and they would have it tuned to the nth degree. They got the dashboard set up, the signature management down pat. But most organizations can't really afford dedicated resources on the IPS. Oh, of course, some of them can, right? And that makes the IPS quite key. But unless you've got that dedicated resource, I found that the IPS kind of, in some cases was ignored. So let me give you an example. I used to work before I started in security vendor land, I was working for ISPs, and one of them that I worked for had an IPS, and it got to the point where the IPS alerts were literally just being funneled into a shared email folder. And that was it. Like, no one was actually looking at them, right? And I think to me that highlights the key problem with IPS. We didn't have time, back in 2008, 2009, security was less of a thing, certainly, than it is now. But to me, that highlights the issue with IPS, and that is signature management. Because if you're not managing the signatures properly, you're not dealing with the alerts properly. And if you're not dealing with the alerts properly, then the value of the entire platform is limited. In fact, whenever there was like a network outage or any kind of issue, what you would do is you would search the email folder for like an IP address. And if there's an IPS alert in there, I kind of blocked this IP address. So you go in there and reconfigure it. But like for threat detection, it was kind of useless. Right. So, fast forward now, and you've still got those problems, whether it's attached to a next-gen firewall or not. And to answer your question, right, so we know now that IPS being attached or being part of a next-gen firewall is good, but A, it can only be applied to the traffic that goes through the firewall, and B, it's limited to the same problems with signature management, right? So that's one component. Now, the other component is when it comes to threat detection, what's happened is that it's largely been centered around the EDR for probably a good part of the past decade. And EDR, endpoint detection and response, kind of became a thing again, roughly the same time, 2016, 2017, first there was Cylance with Next Gen AV, and then there was CrowdStrike with EDR. And it seems like CrowdStrike won that battle. And, from that point onwards, I think that the EDR, as it rightly should be, is a fairly key component in any security architecture, in any threat detection architecture. What I mean is many organizations rely very, very heavily on the EDR to protect them from threats. And I do think that EDR has come a long way to stopping ransomware. Like in 2016, it was like crypto wall and stuff like that. All that kind of like commodity stuff, even WannaCry in 2017, would largely get blocked or stopped and negated by an EDR. However, here's the thing. EDR can't be installed on everything. Right. So, oftentimes you might get environments that are running like legacy, is the term we use, mainframes. You typically get these in banks in the UK anyway. Obviously, banks, insurers, other kind of, sometimes you get manufacturers as well. And what they've got is they've got these old operating like Solaris and stuff like that, AIX that's kind of knocking around. And EDR coverage for that is kind of limited. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that unmanaged devices. So EDR is really, really good on what it's installed on. But if you've got machines out there which you don't know about, EDR is not going to help because it's not on those boxes. So the example I'd like to talk about there is Maersk. In 2018, I believe it was, they suffered quite a critical ransomware attack, NotPetya it was called. And the way that went down was that a nation state infected a Ukrainian accounting software. And it was an update to this Ukrainian accounting software package. Maersk had an office in the Ukraine, and in that there was a server probably sitting in a cupboard somewhere or equivalent that was unmanaged and that was infected. And because of the VPN, it allowed the ransomware to spread. I believe that's how it kind of went down. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected if anyone knows a bit more about that. But I think the key point I'm trying to make is that for many organizations, unmanaged or rogue devices are still very much a big problem. So that leaves a gap, right? That leaves a gap on these devices where you can't have EDR, devices that just don't have EDR. And then to kind of, not to kind of highlight this too much, but there are techniques which threat actors will use in their malware to evade the EDR. Okay. So going back to what I said before, we know that IPS is good. We've got that on the next gen firewall. We've got EDR doing a bulk of protection on the endpoint. but there is still a gap there when EDR potentially could be bypassed or it might not be installed. Now, this leaves us a detection opportunity, and that is, of course, on the internal network, right? If you have one. Many now don't always have a network, which we could talk about in a little bit. But I guess going back to your original question, very, very long-winded answer, and that is many customers or organizations invest in NDR because they have identified a gap in their coverage and they want to know what else they could do to improve their security posture against a hands-on keyboard threat actor.
So what are the pitfalls then if I'm going to deploy NDR? I'm watching out for, because I'm guessing I'm going to see lots more traffic that, I kind of don't know what I don't know. As the great Donald Rumsfeld once said, the unknown unknowns.
Unknown unknowns,
yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of, I know I'm missing stuff, but I don't know what stuff I'm missing.
Okay. I mean, to be open, I think that one of the biggest pitfalls of an NDR, in my opinion, and I'll speak openly here, it's in the implementation. And what I mean is specifically, in order for an NDR to work, it needs to see the network traffic, right? So depending on the NDR tool, very often there is some kind of architecture that consists of sensors, right? That's very, very common. So you need to be able to get the traffic into the sensor in the first place. So that's the first thing. And second of all, so what that means is you need to be able to get the sensor to a spot where the traffic can go into it, which for the majority of people or organizations, that's fine. But you'd be surprised how many times we come across some kind of site, office, branch, remote, whatever it is, where it's difficult to physically get a sensor there for whatever reason. And if you do get a sensor, then if you do get a sensor in the location you want to monitor, it is critical to make sure that it sees the right type of traffic. And this is part of the problem. And the reason is just, what it boils down to, I think anyway, having worked in IT for many, many decades, right? I think it's got to do with the increasing complexity, right? So, you've got networks out there that have been knocking around since like the 70s. You know what I mean? Like they were talking about getting rid of IPv4 more than 20 years ago, if you remember. But basically what's happened is networks have just been built up. You've got acquisitions, mergers, you've got different sites being added and removed. And so what that means is not all networks are actually well known, right? So that can be a problem, because if you don't understand the network topology, then it can be difficult to be assured that you've got the right traffic. And if you're not getting the right traffic into the sensor, the NDR is not seeing the right traffic, then it's not going to be working at an optimal in a way, right? It can only work on what it sees. Now, the NDR vendor should work with you as part of the deployment and make sure that this is operationalized as best as can be. And if there are any gaps, then they need to be highlighted and documented. And the customer needs to, you as a buyer would need to be aware, okay, we're not monitoring this part of our network for these reasons. But I think it's very, very important to understand that. And, to me, that's one of the things that need to be very, very strongly considered. Because the other aspect to that is very often the network, especially if it's been around for many, many years, is not owned by the security team. Okay, so they've got limited influence on what goes on there, and it is difficult in many enterprise production networks, right? And I've been there, probably the same with you, Colin. Things like change control boards, like identifying spaces in rackets, it can be difficult to get sensors out there and make sure that traffic is adequately seen. But that's why it's important for the NDR vendor to work with a buyer to actually ensure that, or obviously a partner as well.
I'm not going to blow too much smoke here, and we treat these with Threatcast as kind of a real leadership piece, but I will say the support from the technical, so from your colleagues, and particularly from a post-sales perspective, second to none. And it's been like that since we partnered over the last 8 years now, I think it is. Your best place, I think, from most of your colleagues, given your experience, to talk a little bit about the integration of NDR with SIEM-Tool 2 in Europe. And I know there's a UK equivalency, if it's not out yet, it is coming, which means many, many more organizations must have 24/7 monitoring of their estates. And NDR, and we've seen it, and you've kind of alluded to, you're seeing an awful lot more traffic, and we touch on probably a north, south, east, west piece in a while, but the integration into SIEM is becoming more and more important, and trying to give an organization that single pane of glass. I know it's a silver bullet. Every vendor says they have it, but actually that means I've got about 50 vendors panes of glass. So I'm trying to get as much as I can perhaps into the SIEM. What's the integration like?
Okay, so generally speaking, I think what we call it is that the NDR is effectively a source of signal into the SIEM. So when we say signal, what I'm talking about, what we're actually talking about is signal that some kind of attack is underway. Okay, so I think depending on how the SIEM is implemented, right? So I've worked obviously in the SIEM world for many, many years. In my personal opinion, I think the SIEM is here to stay, certainly for the rest of my working career, as far as I can see it. I think there are some very, very good use cases for a SIEM, but I personally, my open view is that I think that the SIEM is less of the core threat detection tool than it was maybe 10 years ago. Okay. And that is because of the limitations in the platform and the mechanism by which the rules are implemented. But don't get me wrong, I think the SIEM is very, very good for certain defined use cases, but it's important that those use cases are defined, because otherwise it can get a bit out of control, and the cost of the SIEM can get a bit out of control. And I think that's probably the one key thing that's limiting SIEM as a tool, and that is cost management. Now, where an NDR can be very, very useful is it can do things like monitoring a given data source. In the case of a pure play NDR tool, it would be network traffic, but in some NDR tools, they might monitor other data sources like cloud-based data sources as well, perform analytics on that. So remember when I said that NDR uses the AI ML techniques to detect threats, right? I think that it can be useful to take the output of the NDR, whether it's the network or the cloud, and then funnel that into a SIEM, right? Because what you're doing then is you're analyzing, the NDR is analyzing a very, very, very large data set, distilling it down to a very, very small data set, and then you're feeding that into your SIEM. And going back to what I said before about those well-defined use cases, if you understand what types of output the NDR would make, you could potentially create your own, fairly impactful use cases by correlating that with other tools, such as the EDR, such as other kind of threat detection tools that you might have, or even just setting up your kind of own custom use cases. But you're not putting the buckets of data into the SIEM. The NDR is crunching it, right? And you're just feeding a very, very small amount of data. So therefore, what you're doing is you're managing the cost of the SIEM, because the amount of data you're shoveling into it is a lot less. Most SIEM vendors are licensed based on the amount of data you shovel into them. Not all, but by and large, the main ones are.
Yeah, and interestingly, I've heard one major SIEM vendor has gone from a seat model to a gigabit model, and it's going to make a big difference to those customers that they have where they're dumping everything in. That's for another discussion. So, okay, so in terms of the accuracy and efficiency, how do we ensure the effectiveness of an NDR? I guess a lot of people out there might be thinking of false positives, false negatives. How do we minimize one, maximize the other?
Okay, so when it comes to false positives, false negatives, in my view, I think that's down to the actual platform, not so much the user, right? And this has been the problem with threat detection, in my view, for it's basically the problem with signature-based detections, whether it's an IPS or a SIEM, because, SIEM correlation rules are largely signature-based because you write the detection logic, right? Being able to tune that to a point where you've got the false positives down, but you've got true positives up, right? So you can maximize, what you want to do is you want to maximize the possibility that you detect the attack with the minimal amount of noise. And actually that's very, very difficult to do. So in my view, that's what the NDR should be doing for you, because that's what you pay a lot of money, depending on, let's not beat around the bush, right? It is an enterprise investment.
Yeah.
As is any security software, but this is why you would procure an NDR platform to take that detection, or to alleviate that detection engineering effort, because actually detection engineering is very, very difficult and very, very time consuming. And what that means is very, very costly. There's not many organizations that have got a dedicated detection engineering team. Even the largest ones would have some kind of detection engineering function, but that would effectively be one or maybe two, at most, I would say a small handful of people that do other things as well. You see what I mean? So actually, to save that, an NDR, in my view, should actually remove the onus of you trying to balance the true positives and the false positives. So yeah, so that's kind of what I think about that. Was there a second part of that question? I kind of lost track. Here you go.
Well, again, so we've decided, right, we're going to invest in NDR. We got the budget approval, we're getting stuck in, and I think to your point about the actual implementation is so important, and working closely with your partner on that. So what metrics do we put in place to measure the effectiveness of an NDR solution?
Okay, it's a good question. And actually, I think it is one that we are addressing, we try to address on a continual basis. I think you could largely bucket them as what I would call maybe soft or even subjective, maybe not so much subjective. But what I mean is when a buyer is evaluating an NDR tool, there are metrics or criteria that they would use. Some of those criteria are probably a little bit more subjective than others. And by that, I mean things like ease of use. How easy is something to use? I mean, most people could probably arrive at some kind of conclusion on that, but it's not really something you can measure in numbers. Operational overhead is another one. So I think that one way of actually doing that is, and oftentimes this is common when it comes to prospective customers procuring an NDR, right? I think that the general theory is a good one, and that is running a simulated attack, because an NDR is there ultimately to detect and protect you from a cyber intrusion. So if you can simulate, if you're trying to evaluate a bunch of NDR tools, it would make sense to try to simulate a cyber intrusion and just see how they all perform. Okay, I think that theoretically that is good. What I would say to that, and actually I think that is one definite way of testing the capabilities, the detection capabilities of the NDR platform. What I would say to that is that it can be very, very difficult to do that. It can be very fiddly, right? Simulating these attacks. It can be somewhat difficult in making sure that the same data is being fed to all NDR vendors, all of the NDR tools. And what tends to happen is that organizations will effectively fall back to this kind of methodology where they run some kind of command, let's say a port scan, and then just see, did it trigger something in this tool, this tool, this tool? Okay, green cell, and then you run some kind of brute force, right? Did it trigger in these ones, green cell, red cell, right? And then what it boils down to is an output where you've got, let's say, 3 or 4 different vendors, and this one scored 50, this one scored 30, this one scored 70. Okay, let's go with the 70, right? So what I would say to that is I get it, right? It's very, very common. We see this all the time. I think that doing something like that, you're not addressing the true positive versus false positive issue, right? So it's very important for an NDR tool to get that balance right. It needs to have very broad detection coverage, but the false positive ratio needs to be very, very low. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to operationalize. You need to effectively be able to respond to just about every critical alert that puts out. And if you're not doing that, then it's actually as useful as that IPS that I talked about earlier at the ISP, that the alarms are going to that folder. And if you're running a test methodology where you're just running discrete tests and marking them as green cells or red cells, I think that you're kind of ignoring what it would look like in a production environment, because like things like port scans, yes, they're going to happen, but there's going to be other techniques that will potentially not that easy to pick out from business as usual traffic, and therefore you're going to get a lot of false positives. I think a better way of doing the test is simulating an end-to-end real-world attack and then identifying whether the attack sequence was detected as opposed to individual detections, right? How quickly was that attack sequence detected? How much information is presented to you immediately in the console, and is it actionable from that point? So that's kind of what I'd say. I mean, we can talk a lot more about that.
I'll synopsize that ease of use, operational overhead, detection capabilities, and detection fidelity. That's kind of key ones. I remember I had the pleasure so as you know, I'm commercial, I'm not a tech, right? I never claimed to be, despite my colleagues saying otherwise. That's me being sarcastic, by the way. So I had the pleasure of meeting one of your data scientists 5-6 years ago. And honestly, after about 30 seconds, I'm lost. I was ones and zeros, just like, and we were talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning. So at a high level, can you tell our listeners, what does machine learning and AI bring or how does it enhance the capabilities of NDR?
Okay, so at a very, very high level, what it actually brings is it's distilling a very, 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 very large data set, right, down to a very, very, very small data set. That's effectively what it's doing. Okay, so you think about an organization that's got, I don't know, 20,000 users or even 100,000 users. Think about the volume. It's specifically related to an NDR. Think about the volume of network traffic that they've got going through their core switches, right? So what an NDR does, it analyzes that traffic at scale. And what it's looking for, when I say it's distilling it down to a very small subset, that subset is the signal, what we call a vector, the signal that an attacker or a malicious actor is operating within the environment. So to do that at that kind of scale, where you've got tons and tons of like BAU traffic, where you've got users acting anomalously, where you've got like in-house applications, right? Being able to do that at scale and in a way that actually removes the possibility of false positive or reduces false positives to a bare minimum. That's what the AI is doing.
Now, for the meaty stuff that I love to get into the meaty stuff, tales from the trenches. Like, we had a customer who shall remain anonymous, but they were hit with a ransomware attack a number of years ago. And it was at the weekend. And it was actually, I'm going to say it was the Vector NDR that picked it up, because it started to light up like a Christmas tree. And in fairness, one of the admins, I was talking to the individual afterwards, and alerts were being fired off. And surprisingly, the SOC missed it. Now, the admins picked it up and events ensued, and it was a pretty impactful breach, let's say. What can you give us a few examples maybe of attacks that it picked up, and obviously not necessarily name the victim organization, but what have you seen over the last 3 years or so?
Yep, sure. I mean, ransomware is definitely one. I think that in the case of ransomware, it's like ransomware, the actual deployment of ransomware is often towards the end of what they're doing. Right? What I mean is someone's got access, got in, they've rummaged around a little bit, found the kind of like file servers and deployed the ransomware. There's a lot of steps in there to get to that point. But actually, oftentimes ransomware actors will try to get in, get data out, and then deploy the ransomware as quickly as possible. And we have seen cases like what you described where the ransomware unfortunately was deployed. But this is like the three kind of pillars, like people, process, technology, that the technology to detect the attackers. Oftentimes ransomware actors, they're not always that sophisticated. They use basic tools like TeamViewer actually in most cases that data exfiltration is using this tool called Rclone, which is like a common backup tool. And they just sync it to Megasync, like zip it all up, sync it to Megasync, right? They just want to get as much data out as possible, right? And all the kind of activities that lead up to that can be fairly noisy. Vectra, in those cases, Vectra is really, really good at picking up, even in the earliest stages. And when you get multiple critical hosts, or what we call prioritized entities. But it is, the people part of it. It's important that those, to your point, is there someone actually monitoring it at like 4 a.m., right? Because if there's no one actually monitoring it, then there's a possibility that by the time it gets picked up, that's already done. Like the NDR said, yes, this has happened. By the time you pick it up at 8 a.m., the ransomware is already deployed. The R part of NDR is the response, right? And this is what an NDR tool can do. It can actually institute a lockdown. To me, that's kind of like the next step in maturity for an NDR, because that brings its own risks. And you could risk potential, like some kind of, locking down the wrong thing.
Factory shutdown accidentally.
Yeah, potentially you could cause a network outage, right? Which is actually why sometimes it's not configured. But like the point is that NDR is often very good at picking up ransomware, which we have seen. To answer your question, we have seen ransomware that has been picked up very, very quickly by Vectra. But actually, in some cases, the workflow, the process, and the people just wasn't there to be able to pick it up on time, and the response element wasn't configured. So unfortunately, the ransomware was did kind of go ahead. But luckily, in most cases that we've seen, backup, restore from backup certainly was an option. We have seen a few instances where the ransomware actor was actually picked up in the very, very early stages, because, you look at the sequence of an attack, they need to be able to get a foothold somewhere. Very often that's from a user machine. And then from there is reconnaissance activities and then lateral movement. Even before the reconnaissance, there's like C2. Right, if Vectra can see all of that, which it has been in a couple of cases that I can think about, the C2 followed by the reconnaissance, and we're able to shut that down before there was any kind of a serious action taken. And in fact, there was an instance where it wasn't so much ransomware, but it was more of what I would call a sophisticated red team. You got pen tests and then you've got red teams, right? And depending on the organization and the budget, so specifically the budget that they've got for testing, I think that kind of dictates what they're going to get. But we did have what I would call a sophisticated red team at a mature customer, let's say. And Vectra was actually the only tool that picked up the initial C2 because of the C2 detection capabilities. But it's important to pick up a C2 or maximize your chance to pick up a C2 because that's very often the precursor to any kind of major attack.
Yeah, it's a funny customer I work closely with. They were having a red team exercise when the pen testers heard they had NDR deployed. They were like, they were just shaking their head going. And actually, it created a significant business case to up the budget and reinvest, which was fantastic at the time, and because they were 50-50 on, do we keep it or do we invest in something else? It was actually the result of that red team exercise. So it's fantastic. Threat intelligence, Dan, if we can move on. It's many organizations talk about threat intel, what do we do, and how do we benefit from it? And there are so many sources, be it open market and commercial sources. What role does it play in NDR?
Okay, I think that NDR, right, with threat intel, maybe for those that don't know, the idea is that you've got researchers and organizations that break down attacks and learn threat actors and look at the kind of infrastructure they use and boil that down to, in many cases, they boil it down to indicators, right? An indicator could be a file hash. It could be like something network-based, or it could be like a domain. When it comes to NDR, I think that the NDR, if deployed correctly, remember going back to what we said, if it's deployed correctly, it will naturally see more traffic than anything else, right? More network traffic, that is, because NDR is typically designed to sit inside the network, right? You've got your firewalls, which take threat intelligence feed, and they typically sit on the perimeter. I mean, of course, you've got internal firewalls as well, but then they're not going to see like east-west traffic within a certain area. So NDR, the sensors, if deployed correctly, should see most of the traffic. So actually, I think the NDR is a really good point to put in your threat intelligence. Now, threat intelligence, as we know, like things like IP addresses and domains, can be fairly brittle, but I still think that there is value in that. I think that, the more common ones that we see are it's called FSISAC, like financial services, the paid type of feeds. I still think there's value in there. And, many organizations do leverage threat intel to some degree. I think that probably the most successful ones are the ones where, A, you've got paid threat feed, and B, you might have some mechanism of curating that. And that could be via an internal threat intelligence function. As with everything, maturity in threat intelligence largely comes down to resourcing.
Very true, very true. And we know there are every 6 months you read stats on more and more unfilled roles in the cybersecurity industry globally. Okay, I'm conscious we're on the home straight here, Dan. What advice would you give an organization who are considering to implement an NDR solution?
Okay, if you're at the point where you've actually got first of all, I'd say, the business case for NDR, I think, is important. And this goes back to what I said before. I think identifying some kind of gap in your security coverage or your detection coverage or your security architecture is quite key. I think demonstrating that gap is key as well, but that's not so easy to do. And this is where I think control testing can be quite useful, whether that is penetration testing or through red team or through some kind of partner. There are some vendors that can offer this potentially for you, but that could help to build an internal business case for an NDR tool. If you're at the point where you've already got that and you've got budget for an NDR tool and it's a project, I would say that a proper evaluation is key. And then I think that goes back to what I said before about bake-off, but I would say be prepared to spin that up as effectively a project. Like, there are resources you would need to dedicate to ensure the success of the evaluation and to make sure that it is a level playing field amongst all the vendors that you're evaluating it. I can comment much more about that if anyone wants to kind of ask, but I would say moving on from that, operationalization is key, right? So technical level, making sure that you understand your network topology and where it makes sense for the sensors to sit. If you can't get traffic, then you need to understand that, because that's a gap. And it's not a problem with the tool, right? It's just that you can't get a sensor there for whatever reason. Your business needs to understand that there's a gap there, right? So operationalization at a technical level, but also at a process and people level as well, right? Exactly. We talked about this. You need to be able to consume the output of the NDR tool. If you're not adequately consuming the output, then it's going to be very, very limited. And this comes back to what that effectively means is, like, what does the NDR put out, and are you adequately servicing that? Because if you're not, then you potentially could miss something.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen you've got to make an investment in time, and it's not massively resource hungry. I will genuinely say that. But you have to make that investment in time. I'd completely agree with you. You know, get it right from the start in terms of the deployment, and you've got to keep eyes on it, not 24/7, but you've got to maintain the system. It's so important. Okay, looking into your crystal ball, Dan, what's going to happen over the next 5 years with NDR? How's it going to evolve?
Okay, well, first of all, anything could happen, but then on the other hand, not much could happen because, like what I said, I remember in 2001, I had a lecturer tell me, you need to learn IPv6 right now because everything's going to be IPv6 in 5 years, and look where we are. Look where we're at with that. So actually, my honest view is that there is still going to be especially in the UK, there's a lot of organizations migrating at speed to the cloud, which is fine, right? But there is still going to be networks knocking around there, first of all. Second of all, many of the organizations that are moving to the cloud are doing so at such a speed that they're doing it almost one for one. Virtual machine or server on-prem equates to a virtual machine or server in the cloud, which is fine, but there's still network traffic there, right? So I think that there's going to be some more in the cloud. But I think that there might be some kind of tipping point, maybe, because actually, from what I understand, I could be wrong about this, if you run a virtual machine like in some kind of cloud environment 24/7, it's actually cheaper to run it on a data set in like a physical data center, even like data center costs being considered, because the cloud is actually built for cloud native services like auto scaling and, only paying for what compute resources you use, right? So I think that there might be some kind of tipping point. These organizations that are moving at speed into the cloud might actually realize it's more cost effective to host some services on premise. So I think what you're going to get, I think what you're going to get is you're going to get environments that are even more complex than they are today, right? Because of that reason, you're going to have some stuff in the cloud, you're going to have some stuff on premise. You might still have some legacy stuff knocking around from the 70s, like mainframes and stuff like that. So I think it's going to be more and more important to consider what potential gaps you've got and what tooling could potentially help you with that.
Excellent. Well, listen, Dan, that's been great. Thank you for your time today. That's it, folks, for this episode of Threatcast. I'd like to thank my guest, Dan Crossley from Vectra. Thank you very much for your time. We look forward to chatting again in the near future. And please do join us again on Threatcast. Thank you all and good day.
Thanks, Colin. Good to chat.